So we're in you start to rely on something, and then what happens? They just let you down. 1 Peter 4, 1 through 11. 1296, if you can't see this far. 1 Peter 4, 1 through 11. Well, there's a porn site that I read this article. It had published its statistics for 2018. So this is the site that's absolutely and totally about pornography. It's a porn site. In 2018, an average of over 200,000 videos were viewed each minute. That was the average for the entire year, each minute. Think how much. 64,000 visitors were on the site each minute. Think of how many people that is. I mean, it's often the same people, but even 64,000 people. If you figure that out, over 5.5 billion hours of porn was watched on that one site in 2018. That equals 6,278 centuries of time. It's where our world is. And that was 2018, before the pandemic. Do you think those numbers went up? Incredible. So, how do you spend your time? That's what we're talking about this week. How do you spend your time? Hopefully not that. Think about the impact you make with your life. And it has a lot to do with how you spend your time. The reality is each of us has the same amount of time. We all have 24 hours a day. And some of us accomplish a lot, and some of us accomplish a little. And that depends on how the Lord sees it, not necessarily how we view it. We may think that a little contribution isn't worth much, and the Lord thinks otherwise, because He sees the whole picture. But what makes the difference? The difference is our priorities. What are our priorities? What do we think is most important in life? So let's read our passage. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the Spirit the way God does. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. So what's really important to you? Rick Warren says, show me your checkbook and your calendar, and I'll tell you what's important to you. Things we spend our time and money on are our real priorities in our lives. The reality is, you find time to do the things you want to do. I just don't have enough time, but I have time for this. I used that as an excuse once. Someone gave me an opportunity, and I just kind of frittered away the opportunity and did other things. And then they said, well, did you get this done? No, I didn't have time. And they just laughed. It was the most bitter laugh I ever heard internalized, because we both knew that was a terrible excuse. I didn't have time. You didn't have time for something that really would have been spectacular if you'd pulled it off, but you didn't have time? Really? Seriously? I gave you this opportunity. I didn't have time. Do you think that's going to work with God? I didn't have time. Right. You didn't have time. We have time for what we want to do. Peter warns us not to waste our lives. In verse 2, he says, Christians to no longer live for human passions, but for the will of God. You know, we're not here to be driven by money, not to just have the most fun, not to have people like us. All those things, none of those things are bad things. You know, they're not bad. It's not bad to have somebody like you, or to have money, or anything. But what's the will of God for these things? And sometimes for the will of God, it is that you have a lot of money. I'm not Joel Osteen, but you know, sometimes it is that you have money. None of these things are necessarily bad, but our purpose, the reason we live, is to do the will of God. And then verse 3 says, for the time that has passed suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. And here he's making this differentiation between Christians and Gentiles, and living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatry. You know, that was 2,000 years ago, and things have changed so much. Now we can do them faster. We can do them vicariously. We don't even have to be present in these things to enjoy the same thing. I mean, this is really horrible. It's horrible stuff getting even more horrible with all the technologies that we have available to us. Life is short. Psalm 39, here's the New Living Translation, says, my entire lifetime is just a moment to you, to God. At best, each of us is but a breath. And James says, what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Wow, that just seems fleeting, doesn't it? It's kind of like the steam coming off your coffee cup. Where did that go? It's just gone. You know, compared to eternity, that's what our life is. So life can so easily be wasted. Can so easily be wasted. Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon, and he had all the money and resources available. He could literally do anything he wanted, and he did. So that was his short story. He could do everything he wanted, and then he did. Then he wrote Ecclesiastes. Myself, nothing my eyes desired. Could you imagine having the kind of resource that anything you saw, you could have? And that's going to make you happy. Well, no, here's what he says. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained, under the sun. Wow. So even if you have enough money to buy Twitter, you may not end up happy. Think of that. Solomon had everything and realized it was all meaningless. Didn't bring him fulfillment. It didn't bring him meaning. Didn't bring him purpose. Life is short. It can be wasted. And we need to take an inventory. Paul writes, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." Understand what the Lord's will is. Peter tells us we've spent enough time wasting our lives like the world. He gives that list. And we need to consume our lives with the will of God. So if we want to make a difference for God with our lives, how will we live? It's almost 50 years ago, I made some comment to Mike last week about remembering something vividly from 50 years ago and how depressing that is. 50 years ago, it just went by like a flash. And yeah, a lot happened in those 50 years, and my mom used to say the same thing at 90. It just went by so fast. At 90. You think, oh, that's a long time. It just goes by so quickly. Francis Schaeffer wrote this book, How Shall We Then Live? How shall we then live? The rise and decline of Western thought and culture. He wrote that 50 years ago. It was kind of an attempt to stem the tide of the decline. How did that go? 50 years later, and we're experiencing the decline. And it's just getting stranger and stranger. And the more people think they know, the more they try to unlearn. It's like, but even now, Peter tells us how to live. He tells us 4 things that we need to spend the rest of our lives doing. The first one is praying. And I think this is a praying church. That's kind of what's right down the middle. I'm feeling like Joe Biden now, trying to grasp for words. It's right. It's our sweet spot. That's what I'm looking for here. That's our sweet spot. Prayer is our sweet spot. That's a great sweet spot. He said, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Peter didn't know how long he was going to live. He knew he was going to have a bad death because Jesus told him he was going to have, a difficult death. And so he knew that was coming. But Jesus also promised that Jesus was going to return for his church. So Peter was like, okay, bad news, I'm going to have a bad death. But the good news is Jesus is returning. And if Peter thought, he was returning soon 2,000 years ago, how much sooner is it going to be now? And we're certainly seeing the signs of the times in spades. But in the meantime, we need to spend our days in prayer. We need to get closer and closer to the Lord. That's what prayer is getting close to the Lord and understanding what God's will is. It's not just expressing our wish list. That's part of it. And then He'll sort out for you if you're really listening. If you're not listening, He's going to sort out and you're not going to listen anyway. So you're going to be praying and praying and praying that's not God's will and just, okay. That's like your kid asking for candy over and over and over and over, and you're like, here's one piece. And that's it till next week. But think back over the last week. How much time did you spend in prayer? Psalm 116 says, I love the Lord because He hears and answers my prayers. which sounds a little bit like I love the Lord for what I get, but, it's a relationship that's a true relationship. I ask and then I receive, because he bends down and listens. I will pray as long as I have breath. Hebrews 4 says, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So we approach the Lord because he's a gracious God. And we have confidence because he gives us what we need in our time of need. He gives us what we need. He's not the God of the wish list. He's the God of needs. When we really believe God hears and answers us, it'll drive us to pray even more. In a relationship that you love, you want to be with that person more and more. So do you believe in prayer? Here it says yes. What does my calendar say? How do you answer? Answer with your time, not with your head. If you really believe in prayer, you will pray. Makes no sense to say you believe in prayer and then not pray. So I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, because I'm not going to raise my hand, except as an example. How many of you ask yourselves, how much time do you spend in prayer? How important is it to you? Do you really believe that, not that it works, but that it's effective in your life? Because if it's effective in your life, you'll see change in your life. That's the answer to that. Well, why can't I make this change? Are you spending time in prayer? Are you spending time with the Lord? Have you asked for his guidance? Have you taken his advice? And the idea is to stay balanced. Don't give in to the wild ways of thinking. And there's a lot of crazy thinking about prayer. And the whole thing, the name it, claim it. I named that, and then I got 2 other people to name it too. 2 of my friends came along. We all named it. And it says where 2 or 3, well, that's not really what that means. God's not going to be manipulated. That's not what Jesus promised. He promised to give us what God wills. And he promised to get us into a relationship with God so that we can understand what he wills and understand that that's the best for us. That our wish list isn't always in our best interests. So if you don't want to waste your life, if you want to make a difference in the world, definitely, what can you do? You can pray. You can pray. The second thing is loving. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. And the verse starts out, above all. This means before everything else, in order of importance, before everything else is this: love each other earnestly. So that's number 1 on the list. I'm good at making lists. Well, put that number 1. If you're taking notes, or even if you're not, just note to self. Love first. That's number 1. There's one thing that's the most important value in our lives, is to love one another. Do a better job of loving God and loving people. You might say, well, loving God is much, much more important than loving people. And you really just can't do one without the other. The 2 go hand in hand. Linus was telling Lucy that he wanted to be a humanitarian. And Lucy said, you can't be a humanitarian, you don't love mankind. And Linus says, well, I love mankind. It's people I can't stand. And that's, as a whole, we look great. And it gets down to each one, and we have a few blemishes. But God says to love each other. Someone says, and 1 John writes this, or John writes this in 1 John, I love God. If someone says, I love God, but hates a Christian brother or sister, that person is a liar. You can't say you love God and hate somebody in the family. Well, hate's kind of a strong word. You know how we weasel around it a little bit? Well, I wouldn't say I hate. I think loathe would be a better word there, because it's not hate. Well, for if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we have not seen? I hate when he gets us with logic. That's what that is. Here's somebody you can see. You think you can love somebody you can't see? But you can't love somebody you can see? Wait a minute. So we need to love people and to love each other so we can truly love God. It says we're to love earnestly. Some translations say fervently. It's this word used in Acts for the church praying continually. Without ceasing, when Peter's in jail and the church was just praying constantly. And it's this idea of an athlete stretching, constantly pursuing a goal. So I'm looking around for anyone here besides Rachel who's in good physical. You're in pretty good condition, aren't you? Okay, so there's a couple of you who understand this. Mike doesn't get it at all. He's like, I don't get it. Rachel will totally understand this. This stretching, and you're stretching, the word literally means to extend. About prayer, about loving, is we're trying to extend, stretch ourselves, to extend ourselves in love for each other. So that's a stretch. Loving is a stretch. And if you're like me, totally out of shape, and you stretch for something, it hurts for about 2 weeks. I don't even know what I did. It must be that cushion I reached for. You know, and I was trying to make myself more comfortable. And now I'm sore for 2 weeks. You know, when we're out of shape, it hurts. People who love unconditionally, who reach out to people on a regular basis, it's just second nature to them. And it should be first nature to us. We're called to love each other. Peter tells us loving others will cover a multitude of sins. A lot can be overlooked when you love each other. And we who have been married understand that. If we focus more on loving than judging, we grow a whole lot closer to each other. If you want to spend your life wisely, spend it praying and loving more, and then sharing. Spend it sharing more. This idea of sharing with others is the word hospitality. Verse 9, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. The word hospitality, it actually is talking about love for strangers. Love of strangers. And that was the Semitic culture, was hospitality. When somebody came, you didn't turn them away. You welcomed them. You know, it's opening up your home and your heart. Is that just, well, I guess it's the culture, so I gotta let you come in and stay against my better judgment. No, it's just this opening of your heart. If you want to make a difference with your life, use your hospitality as a way to bless others. Invite others to spend time with you, to be with you. You don't have to be over for dinner, but to just be together. To see you in all kinds of situations, to be blessed and encouraged. Do you ever have somebody who invites you over and then they tell you how much it costs to have you there? These steaks were really expensive, but enjoy. Yeah. Boy, I spent so much time cleaning my house to have you over. Yeah, instead of feeling like a welcome guest, you feel a little bit guilty. Come on over and feel guilty. If you don't feel guilty enough, I'd like to have you over and I can help you feel even more guilty. Yeah, it's that's not hospitality. And then, of course, after you're there, you owe them a return favor, right? Oh, we owe them a time out. It's like, that's not hospitality. That's a transaction. Proverbs 23, do not eat the food of a stingy man. I'd say, or woman, just to be, egalitarian. Do not crave his delicacies, for he is the kind of man who is always thinking about the cost. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. Eat, but don't drink too much. And this is, Proverbs is pretty gritty sometimes. It says, you will vomit up the little you have eaten and will have wasted your compliments. You ever thank somebody and you're actually just trying to get rid of them? That's what this is saying. Your compliments are wasted. Oh, yeah, Proverbs. Read Proverbs. They're entertaining, but true. Yeah, like a dog returns to his vomit. So these are the kinds of the Proverbs are very gritty, but also very memorable and very true. When you share hospitality, don't even think about doing it unless you can do it cheerfully. The whole purpose of hospitality is to show love. It's to show love and to share our lives with each other and to bless people. And then the fourth thing is serving. In verse 10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves, as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. We don't get gifts so we can be glorified. We get gifts so God can be glorified. And not only do we seek to bless and refresh others, but we seek to serve one another. We use gifts God's given us for the good of the whole body of Christ, not for ourselves. In 1 Corinthians 12, we're reminded we are all one body and our gifts are not given to us for our benefit, but for the common good, for the good of the whole church. Or to seek to serve each other by using it. And when we do that, Peter says, we will be giving God's grace to each other. Gifts freely. We don't pay for them. We just get them. And then we're supposed to pass them on and use them freely. So, our inventory, how much have I prayed? How much do I pray? How much do I value prayer? How much do I show love? How much do I stretch myself to love others, to get out of my comfort zone? Remember a book that I've talked about before, but Bob Goff wrote a book called Love Does. Love doesn't think about doing, love actually does it. And I think I gave this book to a lot of you. And he gives example after example after example of getting out of your comfort zone and doing extraordinary things that either were strange things or quirky things or things that you would never have thought to do apart from God's will and God directing you to do them and getting out of your comfort zone and doing them. How often do I offer hospitality without grumbling when it's not a quid pro quo, it's this for that. I'll give you this and you'll give me that. It comes up a lot of times in politics, actually. But and how much do I serve others? How much of it is service, or how much of it is, I think I'll look good doing that. I had a friend once when we used to be in department meetings, and he would always offer to cover for you. Like you'd bring up, I'm going to be gone, I need somebody to cover for me while I'm gone. And he would often, I'll do it. And then after the meeting, he would, I looked at my schedule, I can't really do it. And I'm like, what was that about? That was about looking good in front of the group, but it really was worthless. So how have I served? How have I actually served others without getting something in return? So how are we spending our life? How are we spending our time? Lord, thank you that you love us with an everlasting love. You've given us everything we need, so much more than we could ever deserve. And you tell us how to live our lives. You give us the strength for how to live our lives. You give us all the tools to help us on the way in all the directions. And you keep caring for us when we get lost. You keep directing us in the right direction. You keep showing us your love in remarkable ways. And in all this, Lord, I pray that we would be witnesses for you as a response to your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.